What happens when the world's most powerful military decides a sitting president is a criminal? What does it mean when a leader is pulled from his own capital, extracted by special operations forces in the middle of the night, and flown to a courtroom 6,000 miles away? And why now, after 25 years of diplomatic standoff, economic sanctions, and failed negotiations, did the United States finally decide to act? This isn't just about one man. This isn't just about Nicolás Maduro. This is about geography, about oil, about the flow of drugs and migrants across borders, about who controls the Western Hemisphere in a world that's no longer unipolar, a world where China and Russia are actively competing for influence in America's own backyard. Tonight, we break down the most consequential U.S. military operation in Latin America in over a generation. We'll look at what happened, why it happened, what the geography tells us, who the key players are, what the critics are saying, and what comes next. I'm host Name. This is the Map Desk. Let's get into it. Let's start with what actually happened, because the details matter. In the early hours of Saturday, January 3rd, 2026, somewhere around 2:30 in the morning local time, the United States launched what President Trump called Operation Absolute Resolve. This was a large-scale military strike targeting Caracas, the Venezuelan capital. Witnesses in the city reported hearing at least 7 explosions. They saw plumes of smoke rising into the night sky. They saw helicopters moving with purpose through the darkness. The objective was specific and unprecedented: capture President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. U.S. Special Operations Forces, working alongside the FBI's elite hostage rescue team, conducted what officials described as a precision snatch-and-grab operation. They descended on Maduro's compound, moved with speed and discipline, isolated the area, and extracted their targets. Within hours, Maduro and his wife were on American military aircraft. They were flown first to the USS Iwo Jima, an amphibious assault ship positioned in the Caribbean Sea, then transferred to Guantanamo Bay, and finally brought to New York City, arriving by helicopter at a Manhattan heliport. By mid-morning, Attorney General Pam Bondi unsealed a federal indictment from the Southern District of New York. The charges are serious: narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of illegal weapons, and conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices. The indictment alleges that Maduro and his inner circle partnered with some of the most violent drug traffickers in the world, including the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, to flood the United States with cocaine for decades. Now, these accusations aren't entirely new. Maduro has faced U.S. drug trafficking charges since 2020, when federal prosecutors first accused him of working with Colombian rebel groups to move narcotics. What's new, what's dramatically, historically new, is that the United States decided to go get him. At his Mar-a-Lago press conference later that morning, President Trump called the operation one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and competence in American history. He compared it to the 2020 strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani and to Operation Midnight Hammer, the summer 2025 strikes on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. But then he said something even more striking. He said the United States would, quote, run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. That single sentence changes everything about how we understand this story. This isn't just an arrest. This isn't just law enforcement. This is regime change. And that raises serious questions about legality, strategy, and what comes next. But before we address those questions, we need to understand the underlying logic. we need to understand why Venezuela and why now. So let's put the map on the table. To understand why Venezuela matters and why the United States acted when it did, you need to see the geography. Venezuela sits at the top of South America, occupying a strategic position where the Caribbean meets the continent. Its coastline stretches over 1,700 miles along the Caribbean Sea. It shares borders with Colombia to the west, Brazil to the south, and Guyana to the east. And beneath its soil lies the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than Iran. We're talking about roughly 300 billion barrels. Now, much of this oil is heavy crude that's expensive to extract and refine. Venezuela's oil industry has been badly mismanaged, and production collapsed from its peak. But the reserves are still there. The potential is still there. And in a world where energy security matters, those reserves matter. But oil is only part of the story. Location matters even more. Look at the Caribbean Basin on a map. This is one of the most important maritime zones in the world for American commerce and security. Roughly 40% of all U.S. seaborne trade passes through the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean Sea. The approaches to the Panama Canal, one of the most critical choke points in global trade, run through these waters. The oil refineries along the U.S. Gulf Coast depend on Caribbean stability. Venezuela's ports sit right in the middle of these shipping lanes. For over a century, American strategists have viewed the Caribbean as an American lake, a zone where no hostile foreign power should establish a significant foothold. This brings us to a concept you'll hear a lot in coming weeks: the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, President James Monroe declared that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further European colonization. Any attempt by outside powers to extend their influence here would be viewed as a threat to U.S. security. For 2 centuries, this doctrine shaped American foreign policy. Sometimes it was invoked to justify intervention in Cuba, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Panama, Grenada. Sometimes it faded into the background, but it never fully disappeared. Now here's the modern context. Over the past 2 decades, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and then Nicolás Maduro actively invited outside powers into the hemisphere. Russia conducted military exercises in Venezuelan waters and airspace. Russian bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons flew to Venezuelan bases. Russian military advisors stationed in Caracas. China invested over $60 billion in loans and infrastructure projects, money supposed to be repaid in oil shipments that slowed to a trickle as Venezuela's economy collapsed. Cuba embedded thousands of intelligence officers and security advisors throughout the Venezuelan government. Some analysts believe Cuba effectively runs Venezuela's counterintelligence apparatus. Iran found a foothold too, shipping goods, providing technical assistance, using Venezuela to evade sanctions. From Washington's perspective, this was intolerable. In November 2025, the administration designated Maduro as head of a foreign terrorist organization, putting Venezuela's president on the same list as leaders of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the Houthi rebels. Then the 2025 National Security Strategy explicitly revived Monroe-style thinking. Officials began calling it the Trump corollary, the idea that the United States would actively push back against extra-hemispheric influence in Latin America. Think of it this way. Imagine watching your neighbor invite hostile people into their house for years. They're stockpiling things you don't like. They're making deals that cut you out. They're letting those visitors monitor your comings and goings. Eventually, you decide to act. That's the strategic logic, whether you agree with it or not. The United States looked at Venezuela and saw a hostile regime, a narco-state flooding American cities with drugs and gang violence, a beachhead for Russian and Chinese influence just hours from Miami. And it decided the cost of inaction exceeded the cost of action. Quick recap so far. The United States captured Venezuela's president, the most dramatic use of American force in Latin America since Panama in 1989. The immediate justification is drug trafficking charges. But the strategic context is broader. Oil, geography, migration. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled in recent years, and the return of hemisphere-first thinking. Now let's look at the players. Every geopolitical story has its cast of characters. Here we have 6 major players, each with different interests, fears, and leverage. First, the United States. What does Washington want? 3 things. Eliminate what it sees as a narco-state fueling gang violence across American cities. Tren de Aragua has spread to New York, Chicago, Denver, and elsewhere. Remove Russian and Chinese influence from the hemisphere. Control the migration narrative. What does Washington fear? A prolonged occupation. Regional backlash. Looking like an imperial power in an era when that image carries costs. What can Washington trade? Recognition, sanctions relief, and economic access for any cooperative post-Maduro government. Second, the regime remnants. Maduro is gone, but the Chavista system isn't. It's a sprawling network of military officers, party officials, intelligence operatives, and criminal enterprises. The Venezuelan Supreme Court named Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as acting president, though she's reportedly in Moscow. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez controls the military on the ground. Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello released a defiant video surrounded by armed police, vowing resistance. What do they want? Survival. Amnesty. Negotiated exit. What do they fear? Arrest, extradition, American prison cells. What can they trade? Stability, cooperation, information on criminal networks and hidden assets. Third, Russia. Moscow invested heavily in Venezuela, military equipment, oil deals, diplomatic support. Russia condemned the operation as armed aggression and called for de-escalation. What does Russia want? A Western Hemisphere foothold. A way to pressure Washington. What does Russia fear? Losing another client state. Looking impotent. What can Russia trade? Very little right now. Russia is stretched thin, focused on other priorities. Fourth, China. Beijing lent Venezuela over $60 billion, one of its largest overseas portfolios. Most was tied to oil shipments that have dramatically slowed. Reports suggest Chinese diplomats may have been in-country when the operation began, a deliberate message from Washington about the limits of Chinese influence in the hemisphere. What does China want? Protect its investments, avoid a precedent where the U.S. removes Beijing-friendly governments, maintain Venezuelan oil access. What does China fear? Escalation damaging the broader U.S.-China relationship. Getting drawn into distant conflict, looking unable to protect partners. What can China trade? Diplomatic pressure, economic leverage, or quiet acceptance in exchange for concessions on other issues. Fifth, the regional powers, Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. These countries will bear immediate consequences. They share borders with Venezuela. They've absorbed millions of refugees. All 3 condemned the intervention. Colombian President Gustavo Petro called it an attack. Brazil and Mexico invoked non-intervention principles. What do they want? Stability above all. No refugee flood. Respect for sovereignty norms, because if these can be violated in Venezuela, they can be violated anywhere. What do they fear? Being next. a return to U.S. intervention, domestic backlash from appearing to support American action. What can they trade? Legitimacy for any transition, migration cooperation, or obstruction if they choose. Sixth, the Venezuelan opposition. This is where it gets complicated and troubling. Edmundo González won last year's presidential election with roughly 70% support, but was forced into exile. Maria Corina Machado led the democratic opposition from inside Venezuela, inspiring millions while facing constant harassment. These are the people who should be running Venezuela. They won the election. They have legitimacy. What do they want? Power, recognition, real democratic transition. What do they fear? Being sidelined. Watching the U.S. cut deals with regime figures, the same people who oppressed them, while ignoring actual election winners. Here's the tension. At his press conference, Trump declined to endorse Machado, saying she lacked sufficient respect to lead. He suggested his administration had contacted Delcy Rodriguez, a Chavista regime figure. That alarmed observers. If the United States removes Maduro only to cut deals with his lieutenants, the operation might change faces at the top without changing the system. Quick recap of the players. 6 actors with competing interests. The U.S. wants to reshape the hemisphere. Regime remnants want survival. Russia and China want to protect their stakes. Regional powers want stability. The opposition wants the democracy they voted for, but may not get it. Now let's address the critics, because there are serious arguments against this operation. First, legality. Under the Constitution, the power to declare war belongs to Congress. Several lawmakers, including some Republicans, question whether Trump had authority without congressional approval. Senator Mike Lee pressed Secretary of State Rubio for justification. Senator Andy Kim accused the administration of lying to Congress, saying Rubio and Defense Secretary Hegseth had promised weeks earlier this wasn't about regime change. They blatantly lied, Kim wrote. Second, sovereignty. Maduro was a sitting head of state. Forcibly removing him sets a precedent. If the United States can do this in Venezuela, what stops other powers from claiming similar rights? What stops China from arresting Taiwan's president on security charges? The precedent cuts both ways. Third, effectiveness. Removing Maduro doesn't remove Madurismo. The military security services and criminal networks remain intact. Without a clear transition plan, Venezuela could descend into chaos, like Iraq after 2003. The military operation succeeded, but years of costly insurgency followed. Capturing a leader is the easy part. Building what comes after is the hard part. These arguments deserve consideration regardless of your politics. They don't necessarily mean the operation was wrong, but the risks are real. So what happens next? 3 plausible scenarios. Scenario A. Negotiated transition. This is the most likely path if things go well. The U.S. uses leverage, further action threats, sanctions relief promises, amnesty carrots, to pressure regime remnants. Padrino Lopez decides his best option is a deal. Amnesty for stepping aside. The opposition, led by González, takes power with international recognition. Elections are scheduled. International observers arrive. The economy stabilizes as sanctions lift and investment returns. This requires Washington to support the people Venezuelans actually elected, rather than installing preferred figures. It requires regime figures to choose negotiation over resistance. It requires regional cooperation. Probability, moderate, if Washington shows discipline. Scenario B. Prolonged instability. This is the escalation risk. Regime hardliners refuse surrender. Cabello calls for resistance. Armed groups, including Tren de Aragua elements and pro-government collectivos, wage insurgency. They know the terrain. They have hidden weapons. The U.S. gets drawn into prolonged security operations. Troops initially deployed to secure the transition end up fighting guerrilla war in Caracas barrios. Casualties mount. Mission creeps. The economy collapses further. Infrastructure breaks down. Food and medicine run out. Millions more flee to Colombia and Brazil. This echoes Iraq 2003. Tactical success followed by years of grinding, costly conflict. Probability, significant, especially without a credible transition government. Scenario C, great power standoff. Russia and China decide this is a line they won't let Washington cross. Not through direct military confrontation, but through other means. Russia provides weapons, intelligence, and financial support to regime remnants. Chinese banks extend emergency credit. Cuba activates its networks. Regime remnants form a government in exile, claiming legitimacy. International opinion fractures. The Global South refuses to recognize the new government, seeing this as American imperialism. Venezuela becomes a frozen conflict, a festering wound, a symbol of great power competition in America's backyard for years. Probability, lower, but not negligible if the U.S. overreaches. Here are 5 things to watch in coming days and weeks. 1. Who does the U.S. recognize? This is the most important signal. If Washington backs Edmundo Gonzalez and the Democratic opposition, that signals commitment to legitimacy. If it deals with regime figures like Delcy Rodriguez, prioritizing stability over democracy, that's a very different signal. Watch who gets invited to Washington. Watch the language officials use. 2. What does the Venezuelan military do? Padrino Lopez controls the guns. If he negotiates, orders forces to stand down, the path to stability is smoother. If he fights, if he orders resistance, the situation changes dramatically. Watch for military movements, defections, and officer statements. 3. Regional summits. Watch for emergency meetings of Latin American leaders. If Brazil and Colombia break sharply with the United States, refusing to recognize any transition government, providing sanctuary to regime figures, diplomatic costs rise dramatically. If they quietly acquiesce or cooperate, the path forward is easier. 4. Russian and Chinese actions, not just words. Both condemned the operation. That's expected. But rhetoric is one thing. Material support is another. Do they send weapons, extend credit lines, provide intelligence, or issue statements and quietly write off losses? What Moscow and Beijing actually do tells us whether this becomes great power confrontation or remains a regional matter. 5. Migration flows. This is the canary in the coal mine. The first visible signal of instability will be people moving. If Venezuelan migration spikes, new refugee waves into Colombia and Brazil, more arrivals at the U.S. border, the ground situation is deteriorating. If migration stabilizes or reverses, if Venezuelans start returning because they see hope, things are improving. Watch the borders. Watch the numbers. Here's the takeaway. The capture of Nicolás Maduro is not an ending. It's a beginning. The United States has made a dramatic bet, arguably the most dramatic in Latin American policy since the Cold War. It has bet that it can reshape its hemisphere, remove hostile influence, eliminate a narco-state, and manage the consequences. It has bet that benefits of action outweigh costs, that risks can be controlled, that a better Venezuela can emerge. Whether that bet pays off depends entirely on what happens next. It depends on whether Washington supports democracy or just dominance, whether it backs the people Venezuelans elected or cuts deals with uniformed thugs and calls it stability. It depends on whether the region cooperates or resists, whether Latin America sees opportunity for renewal or the return of imperial intervention. It depends on whether the lessons of past interventions have been learned, whether Iraq and Afghanistan taught anyone that military success is meaningless without political success. The map tells us why Venezuela matters. Geography is destiny, and Venezuela sits at the crossroads of oil, shipping lanes, migration routes, and drug corridors. But the map doesn't tell us what comes next. That depends on choices made in Washington, Caracas, Bogota, Brasilia, Beijing, and Moscow. We'll be watching, and we'll keep putting the map on the table. I'm Host Name. Thanks for watching the Map Desk. If this helped you understand what's happening, if it gave you context and clarity, consider subscribing. We break down the world's most important stories calmly, clearly, and with the depth you deserve. No shouting, no hype, just the map behind the headline. Independent analysis and commentary.